What's up everyone, it's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and I want to talk about a current big rumor going around the industry at the moment because for multiple reasons it's concerning and disheartening and almost disappointing as well. There's multiple reasons for that, but we'll get into the whole deal, what it is and why that is now in a minute. But the big rumor that I want to talk about at the moment is allegedly Capcom are basically bankrupt. And what that means is that they could potentially be preparing the company for a buyout or a takeover. Now, before I get into the possible effects of this, that may be a bit down the line, the problem, or not even the problem, but the big thing I want to talk about first is how disheartening and disappointing this is to me to see such a great company like Capcom used to be back in the day progressively get, we'll call them worse and worse, make misstep after misstep, make bad practice after bad practice, make bad game after bad game, in my opinion at least anyway, and, well, then eventually get to the point where their games are basically being laughed at, their games are basically being panned, they're not doing anything that people actually want them to do with their IPs, and let's face it, basically that has got them into the state they're in now. I grew up on Capcom games, among others of course, but I grew up on Capcom games. I still remember the very first time I ever played Resident Evil 1. I still remember the very first time I ever played Street Fighter 2. There's multiple other games I could go into as well, but you see my point. Capcom have a near and dear place in my heart, at least Capcom of yore. Modern day Capcom not so much. They still do make some good stuff now and again, but the point is they're no longer the respected company, the company that people will praise because of their product and their IPs, because a lot of people think they misuse them, they don't listen to their fans, or they just don't use them. And that upsets everyone, because we want these companies to do the best they can for the simple reason is when they're doing good, that means they're probably putting out a good product for us to enjoy. And as gamers, that's really the most important thing, isn't it? To be able to play a good game in a franchise that you know, love and enjoy. So moving on to the actual possible effects of this whole thing and what could potentially happen. Well, if Capcom go up for sale, basically one of three things will likely happen. One, they could just completely shut down altogether and their IPs and everything like that will just go by the wayside. Two, they could be completely bought out by a different company, a different publisher, a different manufacturer, whatever. I'll go into detail about that in a minute. But before I do, I just want to mention the third one as well, is that they could technically also shut down, but before they do, in order to possibly maybe even get a little bit of money, a little bit of ground back, rather than just lose it all, they could potentially either sell off all their IPs, or as many as they can, and then shut down, or they could sell off select IPs and then try remain open with the money they've made from that. And at least that way they only have to focus on smaller amounts of IPs rather than a big wide portfolio like Capcom actually has. Now when it comes to Capcom IPs, before we get into the positives and negatives for whatever version might actually happen, just let me give you a quick rundown of some of the big main Capcom IPs that people know, love and enjoy over 20 years at this point, even more in some cases. You've got games like Resident Evil series, you've got games like the Street Fighter series, Street Fighter 2 of course being basically revolutionary for the genre. You've got, even though it's a bit more recent and has kind of fallen off as well, Dead Rising, Dino Crisis, Marvel vs. Capcom, although when you think about it that one would completely change if someone else bought them, arguably. You've got games like Onimusha, Mega Man, Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, Ghouls and Ghosts, the list goes on. But you can see, based on what I just listed off there, you already know how popular, how well loved and received some of those series are. And chances are you have played some of those games, be it way back in the day in your childhood or even more recently with some of the more modern ones. And you know that for the most part, they do make some high quality ass games. And it would be a shame to see a lot of them disappear. Now, of course, Capcom do have definitely more games and IPs than this, but these are some of their bigger, higher profile ones, as well as some of the ones that have been around for 20 plus years. So now that we've covered all of that, let's look at some of the potential effects of what would happen if, first off, Capcom either sold off some of their IPs and then tried to stay open with the remaining few, or if they completely shut down but sold off the majority, if not all of their IPs. This could go extremely poorly in my opinion. This is possibly the worst version of what could happen. Well, it's so hard to say because they're all potentially really bad. For example, if Capcom was just to disappear and all their series and IPs were just to disappear, that's obviously a very, very bad situation. But if Capcom were to sell off, let's just say they're selling off all their IPs and then shutting down, it gets a bit dodgy because it all depends on who buys what IP. For example, I don't know, let's assume that everyone has the money to buy all this because we all know Sony is hurting in every single division except for PlayStation. But let's face it, the company needs to do well, not just one division. But we'll assume that everyone has the money. Let's say, maybe Sony buy one game and then Microsoft buy another game and then or another IP and then Nintendo buy a different IP. It gets really weird because it all goes to different individual platforms. And something about that really annoys me is console exclusivity. And not only console exclusivity, but it's also to do with how the company would design and change the games and how they work and everything around them, specifically if they can, remonetize them over and over and over. Because we all know nowadays, especially, some companies just hate single-player games for whatever reason, probably because they think they don't make money. But let's just take some random examples here anyway. Let's say EA bought Resident Evil. You just know that Resident Evil 8, I was going to say Resident Evil 7, I forgot the most recent one. You just know that Resident Evil 8 would be very different. It would probably be an almost Destiny-style Resident Evil that they would have always online and could remonetize and sell you stuff and, buy herb packages or whatever over and over and over. When it comes to exclusivity or even partial exclusivity, look at games like Street Fighter V. Now, I don't care for Street Fighter V. I think it's absolutely awful. But the point is that that's only available on select platforms. It's only available on PS4, I was going to say Street Fighter V, PS4 and PC. Now, this could do well in some ways, for example, not from the consumer side of it, but from a business side of it. Let's look at, say, obviously, Street Fighter is, not just Street Fighter, but fighting games are big and hot on the PlayStation. On the PC as well, but on the console space, they're big and hot on PlayStation. Now, could you imagine if Microsoft locked down Street Fighter? Of course, a lot of people would be pissed off, but from their aspect, that would mean a lot of people, because the fighting game community lives and dies on that, they will have to buy Xboxes, used Xboxes as their platforms. Those platforms, because they're exclusive to that, assuming they're exclusive to that anyway, and not released on PC at the same time. They'll be featured at tournaments, they'll have a shitload more sales in theory. So from a business side of it, it makes sense that they could lock them down. Now, also, on the same aspect of it, you could have someone like EA. And EA, I've already mentioned them with something like Resident Evil, but EA don't really have a big fighting game. Do they have any fighting games? I don't really count UFC, but they could lock down arguably the biggest fighting game franchise there is. And imagine what they would do to it. If you thought Capcom was bad with its microtransactions in Street Fighter, its multiple seasons of passes in one game, its multiple, whatever we call them, like fight currency and costumes and stages and stuff, you ain't seen nothing yet if EA were to get their hands on it. But again, this all comes back to, it depends on who gets them and who buys them, and who buys what IP, and what they do to it, because we know with that company's track record what they could potentially do to an IP or a series of games. And then again, not to mention the whole console exclusivity deal as well. You could have games like Resident Evil only appearing on PlayStation. You could have Mega Man games only appearing on Switch. It gets really, really messy and convoluted, especially because Capcom has always been a third-party developer. They put their games out on multiple consoles, multiple platforms, because games come to PC as well. Yes, of course, they do have console exclusives, platform exclusives, or even multi-platform exclusives, as weird as that sounds. I couldn't think of a better way to say, it's only on PlayStation and Xbox, not on Switch. It's only on PS4 and PC, not on Switch and Xbox. You know what I'm saying. I hope that comes across what I mean, because the original statement I made was very stupid. And this comes back to the final aspect of it, the final thing that could happen. If a company, a publisher, or a different manufacturer, whatever, were to entirely buy out Capcom, not just their IPs, but entirely buy out the company and keep them going. Now, this can be very hit and miss for several reasons. One of which is it all completely depends on who buys them. For example, again, let's use EA. If EA were to buy Capcom in its entirety, every series we have from Capcom that we know and love would automatically be fucked. Because let's face it, that's what EA do. I've made videos on this just recently with the whole Visceral Games studio closed down, and then even like a week and a half before it, I literally predicted that happening a week and a half before it came out. And we could see that happening again and again with Capcom. And first off, before we keep going through some more of the third-party publishers, let's look at some of the actual platform holders. First off, assuming Sony does have the money to do it, it would annoy me if any, not just Sony, but it would annoy me if any of the individual platform holders would actually buy Capcom. Because if Sony bought it, that means Sony don't release their games on anything else. They don't release their games on PC and PS4. They literally just keep everything PS4 exclusive, just so you have reasons to buy PS4. And while I have a PS4 Pro, I have a significantly more powerful PC. Remember, I also have an Xbox One, getting an Xbox One X, and I have a Switch, so that's not an issue. The point is, going from a third-party company that I can play on whatever I want, that releases games on whatever platform they want to release them on. And of course, being on PC, I can play them in whatever way I want, with like 1440p, 120 FPS with above console settings. And then all to be pigeonholed with just buying these 10 different franchises from now on a PlayStation that I've been buying and playing on multiple different things for 20 years. That annoys me. The idea of that annoys me. It will annoy a lot of people too, because you will have a lot of Xbox exclusive owners, or PC exclusive owners, or Switch exclusive owners for some reason, that now can't play Capcom games. Although you could argue that Switch owners can't really play them anyway. But you see what I mean. The fact is, it's limiting the market for these franchises that we know and love, and taking them away from people that are used to them. And I feel it would be the same with Microsoft, although in admission, I do think Microsoft would handle it slightly better from the exclusivity point, because I think they'd also release on PC. Hopefully they'd release on Steam and not that garbage piece of shit that is UWP. But again, this also stems back to one other issue. Actually, before I get to the one other issue, let's look at the Nintendo side of it as well. I really hope Nintendo don't buy them, because one, they would be forced onto just the Switch. You could argue the 3DS as well, but that's basically on the way out. So let's just assume Switch. You would have games that would be taking a generation or two step back from what we know and love just to work on the Switch. It will essentially be limiting creativity and freedom, as well as keeping it console exclusive. And again, regardless of who buys them, not just Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, but this also applies to other third-party publishers as well. It also depends on how they would change the games. Microsoft especially have a questionable track record at the moment over the last couple of years, and who knows what they would do to the games, they would do to the series, or whatever. Nintendo, who knows. Sony, I think Sony would probably change the games the least, to be honest, because Sony does have a large variety of games, both first and third party, that are strong story-based, single-player, narrative games, and they also have multiplayer games. And they, again, first and third party as well, so I think they would be the ones that would change it the least. But that still doesn't change the fact that I would personally have to just shift everything over to PS4. And then you have all these other people who only play on Xbox, who only play on PC, who only play on Switch, that now can't buy these games and play these games that they know and love unless they go out with another 250, 300, 400 euro investment. And then it comes to third-party developers, or third-party publishers as well, I should say. We've already covered EA. Ubisoft, I think, would be the same deal. I don't think Ubisoft would even bother trying to buy them, but I think it would be very similar in if EA bought them as if Ubisoft bought them. I do think Ubisoft would possibly ruin them a little bit less. They do have a slightly better, I say ever so slightly better, because I know you guys already know how much I hate Ubisoft and how much I hate EA, and just for the sake of it, how much I hate Warner Bros. But the point is, you know how much I hate them. And even though, having said all that, Ubisoft do have a very, very slightly better reputation for what they're doing at the moment than EA do. Now, when we look at some of the others, like maybe WB Games, well, we all know they would ruin them completely. Deep Silver, I think, would be a very considerable one to run in the race to actually buy them. A lot of people hate Deep Silver for several reasons. Usually they're only publishers, not developers. I know why a lot of people hate them for certain reasons. Personally, I have a few Deep Silver games, and, well, again, they're all just published by it. Hell, Atlas games are published by Deep Silver in Europe, not by Atlas or Sega. But just to say that I have not been personally affected by Deep Silver negatively, I'm very well aware that That's me specifically, and that a lot of people have issues with them. But when it comes to it overall, I think Deep Silver, there's one or two other companies, actually off the top of my head there's only one other company that I think would be seriously viable for a third-party buyout. A third-party publisher buyout of Capcom, Deep Silver being one of them. You've got other ones as well, like Square Enix. I don't think Square Enix would consider buying them. Not many of their franchises, if any of their franchises, would really appeal to Capcom or to Square Enix from Capcom. Now, having said that, of course, these third-party publishers, the other ones, could technically buy out Capcom and keep Capcom operating as they are, or at least operating as Capcom. They won't leave them completely operating as they are under their own, under their own recognizance, because let's face it, if they did that, that is exactly what got them into the position they're in now. So naturally, some of the, let's just say Square Enix, for example, some of their board members or whatever would oversee Capcom and their decisions, but it would still be Capcom almost in all intents and purposes. You'd still see the Capcom logo, you'd still see the Capcom branding, etc., etc. You'd probably just see a Square Enix logo on there too. Of course, some smaller things would probably change, but you get the idea. But again, I don't think Square Enix would be not a viable, but I don't think they would consider doing the whole thing. Sega, on the other hand, I think Sega and Capcom would make a very, very good partnership together. Between both their histories in arcades, I realize that's a very, very niche field, but let me explain. When you realize what Sega made, both in the arcades and in the home in the past, obviously they've made some mistakes, which is why they're no longer in the console market, but when you compare a lot of the stuff they make and a lot of the style they do in Sega games, it's more similar to Capcom than probably any other company is to Capcom. I think Sega could do it. I think Sega would probably be the best option if anyone was to buy out Capcom. I mean, hell, they bought Atlas, and look at Atlas. They've made some of the highest quality games of all time. And from what we know, the whole Atlas-Sega thing is Sega basically just said, hey, Atlas, do what you're doing, and we'll have a small hand in it. So I think Sega could buy out Capcom, possibly, and, just rejig a little bit of things around in the background, a little small behind-the-scenes deal. Let's tweak it around, get some good stuff out there. I don't know about you guys, but when you look at the Dreamcast had some fucking gems on that console. I mean, even if you ignore the usual top 10 Dreamcast games, they were obviously great games, but they were some damn good gems outside of those lists on the Dreamcast. Anyway, I don't know, this video has gone on way, way too long. It's curious to see what's going to happen. It's also very disheartening, the situation that they could potentially be in if this all turns out to be true. As it stands at the moment, we'll have to wait and see. Personally, I hope another third-party publisher actually buys them out. I think that would be the best outcome and the best option, because I don't want to see these games. Some of them are already kind of exclusive, but that's by choice, by Capcom choice. And I don't want to see not just certain series get locked down, but I don't want to see the entirety of Capcom library just get locked down just because. So I don't know, we'll wait and see. Let me know in the comments section below how you think it's going to go, what you think could happen, and what you think would be the best thing to happen. Who do you want to see get certain IPs? Because we all know there's people out there that would say, oh yeah, X developer would make a brilliant Devil May Cry game, or X developer would make a brilliant Resident Evil game. You let me know all of that anyway in the comments section below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, pray for Capcom, and I will see you on the rest of the videos in my channel.